Margaret Fuller, Anne O'Hare McCormick, Pauline Frederick. Recognize any of those names? Author and journalist Brooke Kroeger introduces us to the inspiring women of the last 180 years who pushed open doors for female journalists of today. Hi, it's Angie from HEC Books, where we talk with authors about their latest titles. Click the subscribe button to see all of our latest conversations, and stick around to find out how enterprising female journalists sought out opportunities for change. Welcome to St. Louis, Brooke Kroeger. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here.
I was going to say, back to Missouri. You're a Kansas City native.
I am. And I've spent time here, too, researching one of my books at WashU. And there was a beau, in high school, and conventions. And once in 1969, I went to the Muni Opera to see Rudolf Nureyev and Margot Fonteyn, a really memorable night.
Well, let me tell you, this is such an important book. 180 years of women in journalism. You just mentioned that, you've done books on Nellie Bly and Fannie Hurst. What made you feel like, I need to do this? The world needs this.
I was just getting ready to retire after 22 years as a professor at NYU. And in my inbox comes a message from a wonderful editor whom I did not know at Knopf, which is a wonderful publishing house, saying that he was keen to commission a work about the history of women in journalism because he couldn't find one, and would I be interested in discussing it? So you can imagine what an email like that is like in our business. They don't come very often. And so I just thought, heck yes, I would really like to do that. And a lot of this material, as you noted, I've worked with in some way or another. What was different about this from previous work was establishing that continuum. So I went decade by decade by decade, and I used two search terms, women and journalism, not woman, but women, journalism. Women, journalism, both with quotes around them, doing each, 1840 to 1849, 1850 to 1859, just like that, and to see what came up. Because I didn't want to go with my own thoughts about this because they've been formed by what other people have written or what books have been written. And sometimes books are written because the material's available, and the person has an interesting life. But does that mean they were important in the field? Does that mean they were creating change? It doesn't really tell you that. It just tells you a great story. And great stories are great. It's not to denigrate that in any way. But I was after something different. So I'd see, whose names keep coming up over and over again. If someone writes a book on the 25 most important women of the 19th century, or the women writers, let's say, what names keep recurring that are also journalists? So those would be some of my keys. Someone like Dorothy Thompson, who's probably a name you don't know anymore because people have forgotten her. She was, the it girl of the 1930s and 1940s. The level of her popularity, of her wealth from journalism was just extraordinary. She wrote a column for the Herald Tribune and then had radio shows, etc., and became extremely important as an analyst and columnist, often almost always on world affairs or important domestic affairs. So there's a point where in 1 year, she is profiled by both the Saturday Evening Post, which is just about as middlebrow as you can get, and the New Yorker, which is just about as, up there highbrow as you can get. Both, not one issue, but 2 consecutive issues of each magazine. Now, that tells me I have to talk about Dorothy Thompson. So things like that would happen. And then I had ideas that I thought were in some ways more important than the stories. So the stories are often about women you've never heard of and wouldn't have heard of, wire service reporters, people like me, the people that aren't in the public eye so much. But the things that happened to them stood for what was happening in the decade to others. So when people say the book is encyclopedic, I say, no, it's not a bunch of mini profiles. The stories are advancing the stronger thread, which is this extraordinary continuum of what I like to call progress, setback, push, pull, right up to the present.
What I thought was interesting, too, is it wasn't that they were just reporting on things. They were changing the way that people were reporting on things. Everybody, right?
That's true. it's not that they were setting out to change things. Some of this happened by circumstance and happenstance. So, for example, getting women into the field, like into those newsrooms in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, how did that happen? There were women who wanted to and were extremely talented, A++ talents, who were also very savvy networkers. So they would do things like write for the abolition press. The abolition press wasn't very wealthy, right? So they needed talent. Well, they were willing to look more widely for talent than where you usually looked, which was to white men. And so by getting their copy in there, well, everybody was reading it. So then from there, these women of the 1860s catapult to writing for The Atlantic, for the New York Times. So very, very smart strategy. And men, editors who were willing to help get them a leg up. So that was pretty great. Then later on, the newspapers, as they become large and metropolitan, realize that women readers are a good idea because that's going to increase circulation, which is going to increase revenue. So they start to develop women's fare, the women's pages, which then become a ghetto for women in a not great way and very hard to get out of because men develop a way of talking about it to say that this is really all women can do. They're very good at gossip. They're very good at society coverage. They're very good at fashion coverage. And these are the things you should be doing. And really, you're not very accurate. So we can't put you in the news pages. There was a lot of that. And that goes on for 50 years or so, quite a while. So that's a problem. And then the stunt girls come along in the 1880s. So this would be Nellie Bly and all of her imitators, of whom there were many across the country, many, many, many. Polly Pry, Annie Laurie, there's lots of them. And they get to do stunts. They are doing detective work. They are doing exposés, undercover, sensations that the public really eats up. But not forever. For, about 6 or 7 years, this is a pretty great trend, and then it dies from overexposure. But it was a place where women could show their mettle. They could show what they were able to do. So that was important. So they introduced a new form, but at the same time, they were showing that the things you think about us are not true in the aggregate. There are many of us who have these skills. And then come the front page girls, one per paper. All these things I've told you about is one per paper, never more. And they're women doing what the men are doing, sometimes writing the pants off the men, but one per paper who can really write what everybody else is writing. And then, slowly the change starts to come. Usually in places, it comes more readily in places that are suffering financially because they're more open to having women.
Just like the abolition papers.
Yep.
Yeah.
Or war. Mm-hmm. The men go off to war and the women get opportunity. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit of a story like that for a long time.
Yeah, because when we talk about those early, it wasn't just that you're an awesome writer. You had to be savvy in even getting in the position, as you noted.
And you had to have men who were willing to have open enough minds to give you opportunity. Mm-hmm. We can't ignore that. What Ralph Waldo Emerson did for Margaret Fuller. She's this gangly, ugly by her own description, off-putting character that people find quirky and weird, and she does something strange with her eyelids and, has an incredible gift of discourse. And he becomes friendly with her. She actually seeks out this friendship. Almost like a mad intellectual crush, as I say, because that's how she goes after it. She makes sure he gets copies of her work and finally gets invited to the Emerson home for 2 weeks. And they become friends. And also with his wife, they all become friends. And from there, he makes her the editor of the Dial. And Horace Greeley is part of that circle of transcendentalists. His wife is crazy about Margaret Fuller and coming down for her conversations, these salons that she's running, and convinces her husband to make her the literary editor of the Tribune, the biggest paper in the country. Imagine.
There's several pieces within the book when you're reading it, and you just kind of have to roll your eyes because it seems so absurd now. You write, a lot of times women would write these phenomenal pieces, and then the title would say,
from a woman's perspective, or
as a woman saw it.
As a woman saw
As
it.
a woman saw it. This goes on
Yes.
forever. I mean, that just never stops for the longest time. Someone like Virginia Cowles, who's covering the Spanish Civil War at an extremely wonderful level, and the headlines have to talk about her Blue Book Boston background, society girl thing. It's really, it's really bad.
So those are the parts that are like, ugh, you roll your eyes at it. What were the parts of the book as you were writing it that, you're taking your notes and you're writing a little bit, scribbling a little bit harder, rolling your eyes a little bit more as you were
Someone
taking
the other
notes.
day said, what parts were crazy making for you?
Crazy making, yeah.
It makes you crazy. So a lot of things like that. There's the story of Melba Tolliver, who was a big local reporter in New York, television reporter, beautiful, charming, really great, and is assigned to cover Tricia Nixon's wedding, and had her hair shorn to a very, very tight natural. Mm-hmm. They cut her out of all the film. They told her she'd have to wear a scarf or change the hair. She declined. And somehow this got into the papers that the network had done that. And so she didn't get fired. I mean, nothing terrible happened to her, but she went on to have a really brilliant career in New York. But having that kind of moment, that's a bad one. There's an episode in the Soviet Union with Aline Mosby, who's one of my favorite characters, someone I actually knew at the end of her life, the last years of her life. And she's a full-dress correspondent, the first woman sent to the Soviet Union as a correspondent for United Press. And she's at a cocktail party, and the editor of Izvestia, for some reason, we don't know the backstory, but for some reason, takes a napkin or his handkerchief, both stories are told, wipes off her eyeshadow and her lipstick, calls her a prostitutka, and tells her to get out of his sight. And she responds by opening her purse and reapplying her makeup. She's pretty good. And then something really terrible happens to her. So after this, and the connection is hard to think did not happen, but two young Soviets approach her to want to have lunch with her and talk to her about icons or things she's interested in. And this is very unusual in 1961. These things do not happen. Mm-hmm. But she goes back to the bureau and they discuss it. So she declines, thinking there's something really suspicious about this.
Yeah.
But they insist, and so she agrees, okay, if we go to a hotel for lunch, the Metropole, which in plain sight, what could possibly happen? So they go, and they keep encouraging her to have cognac. She was a little early in the day for cognac, but she agrees to have a glass of champagne just to be polite. And they're showing her some icons that they had brought for her to look at. I think that was the pretext. And so she turns her head to look, and when she turns back, she sees that her glass has got a little bit of an amber tint. But she takes a sip, and suddenly her head is spinning like a top. And she grabs her purse and, waddles out of the restaurant onto the sidewalk where a camera is waiting and two police officers. She collapses. They take her off to the drunk tank. And pictures of that appear the next day in Izvestia with a very, very based in truth but fake news story about her that kind of takes elements of truth but twists them in a really humiliating way. And her response to that, she was scheduled to leave the Soviet Union at that point after, I think, 3 years to go to Paris, which was her next assignment. And the bureau chief said, you can go now. And she said, nope. She stayed. Great characters.
And that's the other thing that I just noticed was the bravery of these women that just to stand in the face of that and say, no.
Well, think about World War II, where they were forbidden, and yet quite a few of them were not going to be forbidden. You were not allowed to go further forward to the front than the WACs or the nurses could go, which was way back. So women were being sent there as full-dress reporters. They were not there to do features. I mean, many were. I mean, most were. But there was a certain coterie who really were hardcore reporters, and they just were not having that and ignored it. They asked no favors and gave none, and that's the way they were spoken about. They were really really hardcore, and did fantastic work, really fantastic work.
Yeah. One of the other things I thought was interesting that you talk about was the power coupling, right?
Talk about crazy making. That's everybody's favorite in New York, I'll tell you that, because those are all New York characters. So these are couples in the early 1980s up to the middle 1980s, 4 couples of journalists, all of whose names you would have known at a certain point. I mean, they really were well-known journalists working for 2 different organizations. And one was at the New York Times, and the other was at the Washington Post or at U.S. News or, somewhere else. When the husbands would get assigned to go abroad, the women would presume that they could work. And the answer from the Times was no, that you can't work for anyone else. You can't even work for a regional paper because it's too much power in one couple. A lot of excuses like this where their careers were basically being taken from them. In one case that's in the book, there's a big meeting, a second meeting, because the wife is quite aggrieved seeing that her career is getting really stymied by her husband's assignment. And she says the meeting was so awful because he was saying, you want to write a book? We'll help you write a book. You want to do this? She says it was like, you want to do macrame? We'll get you some yarn. It just felt like there was nothing about her. It was all about placating the little lady.
Yeah, yeah. And it was always the husband,
Yeah, and in some of
first.
those cases, as the years have proved, the women have done very, very well.
Well, you mentioned broadcast earlier, and in Pauline Frederick is in, you talk about
Yes,
her.
to see how forgotten she is, and she predates Barbara Walters by quite a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe more than a decade.
Yeah.
And she was an enormous figure, doing very serious work. She had started doing freelance for the Washington Star and developed a technique of interviewing the wives of diplomats. Like, they became really good sources for her. And so that was, a technique she developed. And it takes a long time. I mean, it takes a really long time. But she finally manages to get a network position, and they send her to the UN. And this is when the UN is new. The UN is news. The UN isn't, a side story. It's really a main story at that point because the hope is there that it's going to be something great. And so she does years and years at the UN, but also is a real figure in network television so early. And she was already, not young by the time she goes to TV. That's interesting to me, how many women get their big breaks and start to really have their careers energized in their 40s and beyond, which is kind of fantastic.
You have a quote from Pauline that I thought was so great. She says, when a man stands up to speak, people listen, then look. When a woman gets up, people look, then if they like what they say, they listen.
There you go.
And she said that on many talks that she did.
Yeah, this is like in the 1950s.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not so recent. So that's interesting to me, that all the issues have all been articulated.
180 years. How long did this take you to write?
So probably not as long as you might think, because I started it in the early spring of 2019, but I was on leave from the university, though I hadn't retired yet. So I had no other obligations, and I have no young children. I mean, everybody's grown and gone, so there was none of that. So I work maniacally from very, very early in the morning till very late. And so I can do twice what most people can do in a day if I'm at it, and kind of maniacally. And so, and as I said, a lot of this material, the broad outlines of which were not new to me. I worked on undercover reporting. I mean, I've just worked on a lot of this sort of stuff.
Very familiar with the topic. Yeah.
Not only that, have worked in news organizations and have taught this for, 22 years. So I was up on new development. I'm just up on stuff. And so that was extremely helpful. What I hadn't done was 1840 to 1880. That was new and kind of fun because I hadn't really dived into that. I was going to leave out the 1860s and 70s because I thought, oh, nobody remembers them, who cares? They're fabulous. I thought, we have to have those women in here. So I insisted on keeping them. And I only do the years from 2000 to 2022 as an epilogue because I don't think they're ripe for analysis yet. People might wish for that, but it's just too soon. I mean, we really need more perspective to talk about this period. So what I saw that as a trend that I think is valuable to talk about is the intersection of race and gender and how, and that starts all the way back from the abolition reporting of those early reporters. You see it all through how those two issues intersect. Yeah. And I thought that was interesting to pursue also. So there was lots of new stuff, but there was a lot of the core stuff I had a handle on. And then there was COVID.
Yeah. Right.
Which shut down the libraries. So fortunately, from 2019 to March 2020, I had been in the libraries day and night. Well, not day and night because they close at 5 o'clock, but as long as I could be. And then you couldn't go anywhere. So what was lost, it might have made the book better, who knows, was that ability to turn pages. Because when you turn pages, you find things. So a lot of the really interesting stuff in the parts of the book come out of collections I was looking at before the shutdown.
Within the when you're actually physically
when I say physically
looking,
doing it's things I didn't expect to find, like a few scoops are in there that maybe people won't notice, but there are some scoops. And then you had to ask for things. So it's, will you send me Martha Gellhorn's unpublished autobiography? Will you send me da-da-da? The librarians are the heroes of COVID. I mean, I don't know if people know how much is owed to them, really. They were just fantastic getting things to you, because they weren't in the office very much either. Right. Nobody could be. So that really probably changed how the time I would have spent on the book also, because by March 2020, I said, I think I better start writing. So then I started doing research and writing at the same time, which I ordinarily do not do.
Yeah.
I would usually wait till I had the research, pretty much framed and then start to write. But it worked. It was fine. It was just different.
As everything was during
that time. As everything was. It feels so funny to talk about now, doesn't it?
It does. It doesn't seem like it was that long ago.
Yeah.
I noticed in your acknowledgments you said that it was way, way too long in the earlier draft, so you had to cut quite a bit.
I cut 37 to 40,000 words.
Holy cow!
Well, a lot of it is in those long endnotes because I couldn't bear to lose all the material, so a lot of it I was putting in there so it would be saved. But the editor felt strongly that the book should be readable, so it's really only 389 pages. It's not. It looks fat, but it's not as fat as it looks. And the notes are really fun if you want to go back there and look at them, because not only do they give the sources, but I give some stories I did not include in the text.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about, your experience. So, I mean, you have...
I'm not in this book.
No, you're not in this book.
I'm not in this book.
But as you said, people you've met are in the book. You worked as a UN correspondent for Newsday, Metro editor for New York Newsday, 11 years with the United Press International.
Mostly overseas.
I was going to say, a lot, Tel Aviv Bureau.
Where I became bureau chief for 4 years. I was bureau chief for 3 of the 4. Then they sent me back to London when the company was falling apart. This is when women get opportunity. I was 33 as the chief editor for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. So I had a third of the world at 33. That was pretty good.
So, I mean, throughout your career, you've had to experience some struggles as well as far as being...
It's not until Me Too that I started to try to think back, as people did, to say, okay, did anything ever happen to me? Because there were a lot of men who boosted my career along. It was always men who was in charge. And so 2 episodes come to me, and they're, rather small in the scheme of things, but maybe they speak to what a lot of us have experienced in various ways. So I was in Tel Aviv for 4 years during the Camp David Accords, Sabra and Shatila, the assassination of Sadat, the death of Moshe Dayan. I mean, huge stories. It's just every day was news and front page news so often. And when I left, I was the only woman in the Tel Aviv press corps. Jerusalem had some women that were on contract, but I think I was the only full-time, sent from New York correspondent who was not a man. And the ambassador, I'm sure trying to be nice, I guess, the only thing he could say was that they would miss my legs.
To which you responded...
Nothing. And I was dumbstruck.
What do you say to that?
There was nothing to say. It was just awful. And, maybe he meant I was the only person who wasn't wearing long pants all the time. I mean, maybe, I don't know what he meant, but that's all he had. And I thought...
all the coverage,
Yeah, that's all he had. And then the other thing that happened also in Tel Aviv, my predecessor, when I came, I had a 3-year-old, and my husband was not coming with us. And so the bureau chief fairly, asks our division chief, the job I took after I left Tel Aviv, but it was another wonderful, actually, division chief. He says, gee, we really like Brooke, but, how is she going to do this? This bureau runs 24/7. She has a kid. I don't know how she could possibly manage this. Even though we love Brooke, blah, 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 like that. So I'm going through the files to find, of course I'm going through the files. I mean, I'm a journalist. Of course I go through the files. And Leon's response, he always wrote one-sentence responses. It just said, you're not going to have to worry about Brooke. LD, just like that. And I just thought, oh my God, that is so wonderful. I mean, it was the kind of thing you'd like to hear about yourself from someone.
Well, and I'm curious because you have this perspective now, like you have a wonderful perspective. When you look at the state of things now, I mean, you go all the way up until today in the book.
July 22nd, 2022, yeah.
But when
and a little bit of Barbara Walters' death that I just wedged in there. Because it was so late. Yeah, it was really at the end.
With your perspective, when you look at newsrooms today, what is it that you're hopeful for? And then what's something that concerns you?
Well, what we hope is that they survive, because that's the big issue of the moment. The crisis in local news is horrific, and of course that affects women and men. Mm-hmm. Of course, we see lots of women in big positions now because things are falling apart. There is a correlation there, which is, great for women in one way, but frightening because we kind of know what that means. And so I'm concerned about the ability of legitimate news organizations to survive. That would be my biggest concern, for sure.
And you're hopeful for?
We're hoping that solutions will be found, but we've been at this, 15, 20 years now, and not yet clear. I think the book has a lot of cautionary tales. I think the book is really an advice column for young reporters. Where you're looking at some of these stories and you're going, oh, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And some of the women who've gone very high in leadership and what's happened to them are, I think, really interesting cautionary tales. So I thought that was an important thing to include, very much so. Anyway, I just think it has a lot of contemporary resonance that, could make you a little smarter when you go about thinking about building a career.
Thanks for watching. Give a thumbs up if you enjoyed this conversation and get notified when new author conversations come out by clicking subscribe.